and not really well organized. There have been several attempts to bring opposition groups, be it on the ground or abroad in the diaspora together. But so far as I can judge, I think these attempts have been, or the results of these attempts have been rather weak. We still don't have any strong united opposition, which is kind of challenging in political terms as well as in military terms the regime, and able to oust the regime and to delegitimize it. Well, this has many reasons. I don't want to go too much into depth, but one of the let's say perceptions, and this is also, I guess, very important from a foreign point of view, is whereas the media coverage of the Syrian conflict was very clear on the side of the rebels and of the opposition, this has changed over the last, let's say, year or so. It has more and more turned into a more critical stance towards the fighters against the regime, and this has to do with a growing number of Islamist extremists being part of the militias, and some of them also having connections to al-Qaeda, as it is alleged. When we look at the countries, and this brings me already to the let's say first country which is playing a very serious role in regard to that conflict, which is Iraq. This has become a very important retreat area for or let's say recruitment and retreat area for Islamist extremists. It is somehow the curse of history that a couple of years ago it was the other way around, that people came through Syria to Iraq to fight against the Americans. This has now changed. We know, and this has recently happened, about events taking place in Fallujah, for instance, where Sunni rebels were supported by radical Islamist groups. They're all very often named as al-Qaeda groups, which is quite difficult to determine whether they are really part of al-Qaeda or not. But apparently there is one group which is playing a major role in that regard, which is the group which is defending an Islamic State in Syria, in Iraq, and in the Levant. Iraq is also important in regard to the Syrian conflict because of, I think this is not working anyway, now, okay, sorry for that. Can I put it here? Sorry. This one is going to work. This one? Okay. I have, okay, yes. Oh, sorry, this was, okay, I'll stay like that. I'm sorry for the inconvenience. Iraq is also important in regard to the Kurdish, let's say, issue involved with the Syrian conflict, because the Iraqi, the Kurdish autonomy region in northern Iraq has become an important player in recent years, and it has been a very stabilizing factor in the region. And in regard to Syria, the Kurdish autonomy region has also tried to play a role in uniting the Kurdish, groups within Syria. And here is another difficulty which should be added, because I think the Syrian conflict, what makes it the Syrian conflict so complicated is that there are so many different layers, not only on the regional and international stage, but also on the national stage. As I mentioned, there are so many different groups fighting against the regime, but also fighting against each other. And in regard to the Kurdish population within Syria, this is also not a united oppositional movement representing the Kurds within Syria, but there are also different fractions and groups. And some of these groups are supported by the Kurdish autonomy region in northern Iraq. So they are closer, let's say, to the KDP in Iraq, Barzani's group, rather than, say, for instance, to the PKK. And this is the other side of the coin. There is the PYD operating within Syria, which has organic, let's say, connections with the PKK in Turkey. Even though they deny it, there is, let's say, a common ideological ground. They are both leftist groups, and they are also within the same umbrella organization. And staying with the Kurdish issue within the Syrian conflict, this shows us, or this hints at a rivalry which is coming up between the Kurdish autonomy region within Iraq, in northern Iraq, and the PKK and its different organizations in the struggle over dominance and influence within the international Kurdish or transnational Kurdish community, which goes, of course, beyond Syria and northern Iraq. Also, in Turkey, there is a huge community, and within Iran, and also in some of the other neighboring countries, but at lower numbers. So what we can see is also a kind of rivalry between the northern Iraqi Kurdish autonomy region and the PKK over the representation of, let's say, Kurdishness on the international and regional level. Going south of Syria, Jordan is facing the problem that it is already a not so, even though it looks very stable, talking about Jordan, you can also detect a lot of instabilities ahead in terms of demography, in terms of how rooted the royal family is, and so on and so forth. So adding to these already existing problems, Jordan is facing now a huge flow of refugees coming from Syria, and also Palestinian refugees coming from Syria to Jordan, which adds additionally to the already difficult demographic situation in Jordan. I quickly continue to the south, Israel, another neighboring country. It's not very clear what Israel's strategy or policy towards the Syrian conflict is, but apparently the Israeli government is not it does not have any interest in getting actively involved in resolving the conflict. It is pursuing a policy which can be summarized as long as they're beating each other, they won't be a trouble for us. And in that sense, the Bantustanization of Syria into the falling apart of a strong Syrian state into little small entities is not so much contradictory to, let's say, Israel's security interests. Next country bordering on Syria is Lebanon, and there has been a lot of speculations on the repercussions and spillover effects of the Syrian conflict on Lebanon, and it is actually a miracle that Lebanon is still not that destabilized as we would have thought 2 years ago, because there is a flow of an enormous number of refugees coming from Syria, and of course they are encountering a situation which has been already very explosive within Lebanon due to the ethnic and confessional tensions within Lebanon. So this is another adding to the already existing conflicts. And last but not least, I'll come to Turkey, which is, of course, playing a major role in that conflict, a more active role than the countries I mentioned already. Together with Iran, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, is Turkey one of the big regional players in regard to the Syrian conflict. I think the Turkish position, I will be talking about the Turkish position and the repercussions of the Syrian conflict directly on Turkey. But I think I would like to go back to the beginnings of the start with the beginnings of the Arab Spring, so to call. I think Turkey was quite surprised by what, just as anyone was surprised. Actually, no one was really prepared for such a thing. But Turkey was surprised and didn't know how to react in the beginning, and it was very hesitant in reacting to it. It has been one of the advantages of Turkish foreign policy under the Foreign Minister Ahmet Davutoğlu that the Turkish foreign policy has become very pragmatic and adaptable to new circumstances. And we saw that adaptation first when the uprising in Libya started. In the beginning, the Turkish government was very reluctant to support those protesting against Gaddafi, because also Turkey had domestic interests within Libya. There were at that time 25,000 Turkish workers on the ground in Libya, and there were many Turkish companies involved mainly in construction businesses within Libya. But that soon changed, and Turkey also, after having negotiated with its allies within NATO, changed sides and strongly supported, even though not actively, but strongly supported the opposition against Libya. I think the Libyan case played an enormous role in Turkey's decision-making in regard to the Syrian conflict. Because when we look back, Turkish-Syrian relations haven't been that fantastic for many decades, and the Turkish-Syrian relations saw a serious change in strategy, mainly coming from the Turkish side, in the mid-2000s. It was somehow a part of the Europeanization of Turkey's foreign policy. It was an extension of the EU's approach to build peace and stability through economic interdependence. And that was also Turkey's strategy in regard to its neighbors. And one of the, let's say, model countries in this new approach of Turkish foreign policy, which has been coined as zero problems policy with neighbors, was Syria. And so what we saw was a very rapid shift in relations, and an improvement in these relations, an improvement in trade exchange, the opening of the borders for free travel without visa, and many other things. And part of that was also a very tight personal relationship between Prime Minister Erdogan and Bashar al-Assad at that time. They went even together on holidays in Bodrum. I don't remember the year, but it's not that far away. So it's interesting that after this, let's say, very short but intensive history of a different Turkish policy towards Syria, Turkey first hesitated when the uprising or the protest, let's say, in Syria started, and then turned into an uprising. When it turned into an uprising, the Turkish government quickly shifted from the position of, hesitating to a very active position in supporting the opposition and to the regime. And I think this was actually the reasons why Turkey changed its position that quickly has to do with miscalculations. I think that the Turkish government thought that things would evolve as they did in Libya. They did not think that it would turn into such long-term conflict with so many repercussions on all the countries in the neighborhood and the whole region, and even on the international stage. Turkey took side with groups which were supporting the opposition. Among them, I mentioned Saudi Arabia and Qatar, but also, of course, behind the scenes, the US and Great Britain and France. I think it would be naive to believe that Turkey was very autonomous in its acting in in regard to Syria. I think that the Turkish policy has been, let's say, very much in line with the US policy towards Syria. And by the way, this has also to do, I will mention two things. One thing is that the Obama administration, from the beginning on, from the first administration, already saw Turkey as a gateway to the Middle East, because there was this beginning after 9/11, or let's say starting with 9/11, parallel to the anti-terror discourse on the international stage, which had the source, of course, mainly in the US, there was also a parallel discourse on Islam and democracy. And the Bush administration, on the one hand, pursued war on terror, but on the other hand, they also tried to promote democracy in the region, at least on the discursive level. And Turkey was a fantastic example for the American discourse on the compatibility of democracy and Islam, because after the coming into power of the AKP government, the AKP, which is a party which split off from the Islamist movement and is a, let's say, Islamic conservative but democratic party with recent developments might point at a different direction, but still, it is a democratic party within a democratic system. So this perfectly fit into the discourse of the compatibility of Islam and democracy, which was, of course, a counter discourse to, let's say, which was created and constructed as a counter discourse to Al-Qaeda and radical Islam. It was a hope that the support of democratic and Islamic or Islamist groups within the region might help to overcome also radicalization and extremism. This is one part, or one layer, let's say. On the other side, the Turkish government, of course, was very willing to take up this bestowed position by the Americans, let's say, that it was highlighted as a key country, as a gateway into the region, because it enhanced Turkey's importance and added to Turkey's role or aimed role in a regional on a regional level. So this is, let's say, the backside, or against this background, things developed in regard to Syria. As I mentioned before, I think it was a serious miscalculation on the Turkish side, because they thought that the conflict wouldn't last that long, but that was also connected with the miscalculation of the Americans, who also thought that it wouldn't take that long. I think that the Turkish position isn't that far from the judgment, or has to do very much with the Americans, with the judgment of the Americans and the strategies the Americans established. What happened was that the U.S. were not very willing to take an active role in this conflict. They didn't want to play an active role in the Libyan conflict neither, certainly because Obama was elected as president because he heavily criticized the involvement, the American involvement in Iraq, and because his administration's #1 goal was to get out from the region, get the troops out from the region, be it from Iraq or from Afghanistan. So this is why the Americans didn't want to get involved in any active military conflict just such a short time after they had withdrawn from the region. And this falls into a general American strategy, which is shifting the emphasis of American military strategic interest. It's mainly the military. That doesn't mean that the US withdraws from the whole globe and is not interested anymore in Middle Eastern affairs, but they just don't want to get involved into Middle Eastern affairs with troops. They shift their, and this was announced by the administration, the new focus is the Pacific and the China Sea mainly. So as part of that strategy, it is important to get allies and preferably local and regional allies more involved instead of sending American troops there. And as part of this strategy, I think the Americans tried for a short time to set together a potential force to intervene in Syria, but also the regional players were rather reluctant to get involved there because of the implications and the connections the Syrian conflict has on a regional and international level. And what they chose was a very blurred line, which was supporting secretly some parts of the fighting troops on the ground with weaponry and logistic support. And much of that support flew and has been flowing through Turkey. The Turkish government has been very outspoken in regard to intervention on a discursive level, but I think when it would come to a real intervention on the ground, the Turkish government would have serious difficulties to push it through the parliament in Turkey, as well as to push it against the public opinion, because even the majority of supporters of the government, about 60%, that was a survey which was done last year, but around 60% of AKP supporters were against any involvement in the Syrian conflict. And this has to do, of course, with growing tensions within Turkey, political tensions and ethnic tensions, and also and sectarian tensions, if you want to call it that way, which have to do with Turkey's involvement in the Syrian conflict. First of all, the Kurdish issue has become even more important from the point of view of the Turkish government, because the danger that something like in northern Iraq might evolve in northern Syria, another autonomous Kurdish region which has transnational connections with the Turkish with the Kurdish provinces within Turkey, used to be a horror scenario from the, let's say, security point of view of the Turkish security establishment. But it had also, on the other hand, a positive impact because it pushed the Turkish government to open up to the PKK and its and groups which are close to the PKK, and start peace negotiations, even though they are very progressing in a very slow tempo. They are still taking place. But it had also repercussions on a sectarian level, as you said, because it added to the already existing doubts about the AKP government's Sunni conservative agenda, and it raised particularly mistrust among Alawite groups within Turkey. Of course, the flow of refugees in enormous numbers. There have been rumors that it's more than 700,000 people who are mainly even not registered in Turkey, are living already within Turkey. And many of them are living in the Hatay province, which used to be a Syrian province during during Ottoman times, and then also during the Mandate. There are rising tensions within the Hatay province, and there have been reports and research has been done, let's say, on the Gezi protests which took place in last June in Turkey, which started off in Istanbul because of, as you might remember, because of a urbanization project in the center of Istanbul, but which had, of course, to do with a growing criticism in regard to the government's general policies, which have been more and more shaped by authoritarianism and intolerance towards oppositional voices and groups, particularly against media and so on. Interestingly, they started in Istanbul with a very local problem, but they spread over the whole country, and the movement, the Gezi movement, was particularly strong in the Hatay province. There has been done a lot of research afterwards, and apparently one could even call what happened in Hatay, because that did not really have to do, or let's say some of the reasons were the same, but of course it was not about the urbanization and gentrification project in Istanbul anymore. It was about many other things. But what happened in the Hatay province can be also named as a Alevi uprising against the government. So this is one of the big repercussions and influences or connections we have with the Syrian conflict directly within Turkey. I think I don't have that much time anymore. I'll make the round complete by saying that what we see now, what the Geneva conference is actually a let's say a shift in strategy, the result of a shift in strategy of American policy towards Syria. And a re-emergence of Russia on the international stage as an active player in the Middle East region. Because from the beginning on, the Russians said, we can't deny that there is a regime, we have to talk with the regime, there have to be negotiations, and so they didn't throw themselves directly on the side of the opposition as the Turkish government and the Americans did together with the Saudis and the Qataris, but they had also different interests involved in that regard. So what we see now is a change in strategy on the American side. There is no more talk about that the regime has to go before negotiations can start. There is an admittance somehow that it's impossible to resolve the conflict without getting the regime into on the negotiation table, and what we see is also a soft shift in Turkey's strategy, even though it is still not on the discursive level. The prime minister and the foreign minister, they're still affirming that Assad has to go, but it's also a different thing to say Assad has to go or the regime has to go. I think this is also, it can be also seen as a slight adaptation probably, but more important than that is probably Tayyip Erdogan's visit to Iran last week. When he visited Tehran, the official program was launched as talks on economic relations, energy issues, and so on and so forth. But there have been also a lot of rumors that actually the major topic was Syria. And this can be seen as what I tried to define in the beginning, that the Turkish strategy has a lot to do with the American strategy, because there has been a serious shift in strategy, not serious shift in strategy, but let's say there has been a change in Iranian-American relations over the last months. And there is the engagement policy towards Iran, in my opinion, will continue. That will change the balances in the region in a certain way. And so Turkey it doesn't make sense anymore to stand alone as maybe a big and important regional player, but as a less important international player, and defend intervention if no one is ready to intervene. So what we will see in the next months is a slight shift in strategy. And I think from a Turkish political strategic point of view, it was a misconception and to throw themselves into the line with the opposition in such an outspoken way, and to cut off all relations with any other groups within the regime, potential groups. This is why Russia has remained actually the only negotiator between, let's say, an international community and an opposition and the regime on the other hand. So this is why the Russian position has somehow gained more importance over the last weeks. Coming to the EU, there is not much to say, because the EU as such doesn't really play any role in that conflict, a part of positive remarks and calls for, peaceful solutions and so on. It's a lot of talk, but there is no real strategy or policy, and there can't be a real strategy and policy, of course, because there is no coherent and common foreign policy of the EU as such. But what can happen is that once a day that there is a solution, maybe through negotiations has been, or let's say there has been a transitional process decided on through negotiations, the EU can of course support such a thing. I think the EU is more a player in post-conflict situations rather than in conflict situations, let me put it that way. And, but of course there are some EU member countries who are playing an important role, such as the French and the Brits, and maybe more so the Germans, as the German foreign minister and even Chancellor Merkel said that they want to put more emphasis on Germany's role on the international stage. I don't think that Germany would become involved in any active military involvement or intervention, such as no other group or country I mentioned would want to become involved. Well, I think I'll stop here, and if you have any comments or questions, we could.
Sharing with and without the sound support, getting a better understanding and a broader understanding of Syria and in the playfield of politics, so to speak, unfortunately. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask. We don't have a microphone for the audience. We hopefully will have one today, so I'm asking you to please stand up and speak up, and hopefully everyone will.
Maybe I'll also stand up.
Stand as well.
Now I can.
Please, we had first the gentleman over here, and then We'll take you.
Thank you very much. My name is Emre Karagar. I'm coming from the same country. Cengiz Günay. And for 3 years I was serving in Sarajevo for work, so I know the meaning of the word, a problem from the hell, which was first time used in the 90s for the war going on in Sarajevo, Bosnia, large and Sarajevo specifically. Can you hear me? Just a couple of 4 or 5 days, the second time I'm listening to you, and it was really refreshing, intellectually refreshing.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for the comments, but I have a couple of remarks that maybe I can add. Summarize what US influence. US has influenced everywhere, but it's a group of countries which they come together, they create joint policies, and the United States is one of them. And that's why international organizations are formed, and that's why countries come together to exchange money. But Turkey is in a special position, especially coming from its autonomous past. From the area, geographic area, starting from Afghanistan till Bosnia, when a problem occurs, when a problem happens, every single, I cannot say every single person, but most of the majority of the population just look back to Turkey. So, and Turkey has a very bad experience coming from all the events in the Balkans. If that specific problem does not stop, that means people start migrating to Turkey. And this is exactly what happens in the Balkans, and this is what happens at the crisis of Syria. At the moment, we are hosting, not a rumor, we are hosting something like 650,000 of refugees, which is third after Lebanon and Jordan, and after that Turkey. We have spent something like $2 billion specifically from our own national budget. And the international community has assisted something like $200 million to that whole picture. So Turkey has a right to that, right? Turkey has a right to organize its own policies. And I cannot only say it was the United States who was dictating on Turkey to go on that specific policy. Second, Assad has to go. I mean, everybody is saying that, and for 3 years, Turkish officials are saying that, and Mr. Davutoglu at Munich Security Conference was saying that, because Assad is using chemical weapons. Using chemical weapons is something like using nuclear weapons. And Assad should go not only because using chemical weapons against its own people, but it has the potential to use its conventional weapons against its own people also. So Assad has to go. And since last 3 years, Turkey is supporting the policy that united democratic Syria has to be created. And this has not changed a bit since last 3 years. And this was voiced by Mr. Lohlker at Munich conference. I have many things to say, but just in a nutshell, these are the worst things I have.
Can I respond? Just I putting myself wrong. I don't see Turkey as a proxy of the United States. That would be too simple. I think that Turkish foreign policy has very much shaped by the judgments made by the Americans on the conflict. Of course, it's an independent decision-making process, and Turkey had. But I think that the miscalculations, let me put it that way, that the miscalculations of the Turkish government with regard to the Syrian conflict were connected with the miscalculations of the U.S. Okay. Yeah. Please.
I would like to thank you for this well-done research and deep analysis by your friend.
Thank you.
But this is, I think it was something was not be said. Was not be said here.
It doesn't. It's
about the American policy toward the Syria conflict and about the Turkish policy toward the Syria conflict. In the beginning, Syrian revolution have begun after 3 successful revolutions in the origin in the Middle East. We have seen that within 1 month, the Tunisians have imposed the people willing, and Ben Ali was disposed. In Egypt too, within 2 months, the same. And we have seen that in Libya, when the revolution have begun to use the weapon, the international community has intervened. This thing have inspired the Syrian people, the Syrian young people, that me too could have the possibility to overthrow this tyranny we are suffering of since more than 40 years. I think the misdoing by the Turkey and the American, the big promises have been given to the opposition that you will have a big support from the Turkey and from the West and from the free world. And every month, month by month, those promises was false. And the opposition didn't receive anything, leaving the land for the extremism. 2 kinds of extremism. We know that we have the Shia extremism by Iran, Hezbollah, and those fractions coming from Iraq, Pakistan to support the regime and to repress the Syrian people very brutally, as we can see here. This is nothing. We have seen before what had happened with the Syrian people. This action by those sectarian Shia fractions make a fertile land to another extremism, the Sunni extremism, for the Al-Qaeda organizations to be more and more powerful inside the country. All this was continued under the eyes of the Americans, the Europeans, and the others. And there was no willing to do anything for stopping this. What do you think? Why they didn't try to prevent the extremism inside the country? They left them to fight each other. Is this kind of interest? Does the United States and Israel have interest to leave Hezbollah fighting Al-Qaeda and to make both of them less powerful without paying any dollar or blood? This is my question.
Thank you. Should we take which was consisting of how would you call the detected people from the Syrian army, people defected, sorry, from the Syrian army. So the idea was to build up an organized structure.
You think that they were serious in doing this?
Well, I don't know if but they tried to do it. And the thing was that this unit they tried to build up fell also apart. I think it was a problem that they did not really know who to support on the ground. And if you don't have any strategy, and the Turkish border was quite open for a flow of weapons and also fighters, it's then difficult to control in. Thank you. It's then difficult to control afterwards. It's once you have this reality there, what can you do? And it has also to do, of course, with the discourse which has gained ground in the whole Arab world among extremist groups. I mean, it's interesting, for instance, that Salafi groups in Tunisia, which are more, let's say, radical than Salafis in Egypt, there are some Salafi groups who are fighting close to the Algerian border against the Tunisian government, but there are also some more radicals among them, let's say jihadist groups, who have defined Tunisia not as a place to fight jihad, but who have defined Syria as a place to fight jihad. So you have a whole, let's say, travel routes of jihadist groups, not only from within the Arab world, but also we know that there are some people from European countries who went there to fight against a regime they have defined as infidels. I think it is this discourse on the fight against infidels and this discourse on Sunnis against Shiites and so on. This was also created by the regime somehow, because they defined everyone who was fighting against them as Islamist radicals, and it was also, this is how discourses happen, it had respondents among those groups who regarded the Syrian regime as infidels and who thought it's important to go there to fight jihad against the infidels. So I think we have this, you know, not very easily, a vicious circle which is not really easy to control, which also contributed to that situation. Yes, please.
I know the Kurds in West Syria, the Kurdish area, had a military victory against the Islamic attacks in the last months, I think. And I know that the Kurds all the world, not only in Syria, have big hopes since centuries again to become independent. Do you think that the Erdogan regime is ready to attack against this area in the next time?
You mean to attack against the YPG?
Yes.
No, I don't think so, because much of Turkey's strategy towards Syria had also to do with the trauma of the Iraq War, from a Turkish perspective. What many people within the security establishment thought was that Turkey had missed a chance because it did not take part in the war on Iraq against Saddam Hussein at that time, and they didn't want to make the same mistake when it came to Syria, because the fear was at that time, and that I mentioned it earlier, that something like an independent state in northern Syria might emerge after the conflict within Syria, and which might challenge Turkey's sovereignty as well on the Kurdish provinces within Turkey. So this had a lot to do with, in my regard, with Turkey's strategy. That was also a lot shaped by the fear that the result of this conflict might be an independent Kurdistan. But when you look at developments, actually relations between the Kurdish autonomy region in northern Iraq and the Turkish government have seriously improved. And they have improved because the KDP and the PUK in northern Iraq are, as I mentioned earlier, somehow rivals with the PKK in regard to the dominance and influence over a transnational Kurdish community, that's our nation in that sense. And what's interesting is that the Kurdish autonomy government in northern Iraq, there is a lot of pressure coming from the people there for independence, because they say, why should we stay within the Iraqi state, which is such a mess? We want to export our own natural resources, we don't want to be dependent on Baghdad and so on. But interestingly, the government is against independence. They are against independence because they say that that would throw them into a sea, a wide open sea, and expose them to much more dangers than staying within the borders of Iraq now. It is a strategic decision. It is not because out of the love for Iraq or for the Iraqi nation state. It is a decision which is on a logical, rational level, maybe, let's say. It's not a passionate decision. And then on the other hand, if you think in a postmodern way or approach, do we need in future, do borders play the importance they used to play? I mean, do we need any more a united Kurdish state, or is it the interconnectedness, transnational connections, trade, and all these kind of things, and the cultural area which might emerge, which might make a Kurdish state still maybe a desire for many people, but maybe not as necessary as it was in the past for many people, let's say. If you can, there's a free flow of people across borders that might lose, let's say, that importance. But of course, on a symbolic level, it is important. And then on the other hand, the problem within Syria is that you have the rivalry between, as I mentioned before, those groups which are close to the PKK and those which are close to the northern Iraqi autonomous region, which is not only a regional difference, it is also an ideological difference. One group is more leftist, Marxist, let's say, influenced and more revolutionary, and the other group is more conservative, more which emerged more out from a feudalistic societal system. And in that sense, I think there is, we will see this rivalry between these two groups continuing in the next time, but I don't see any Turkish military involvement in regard to the PYD, particularly because there is now this peace negotiation process between the Turkish government and the PKK, which is a big chance for both sides, and which is particularly an important issue for the AKP government, which couldn't deliver in recent times so many economic and political reforms as people would have expected from them. And let's say, a resolution of the military conflict within Turkey would be a big achievement of this government, which has been weakened over the last year, seriously weakened.
If there are no other questions, I would close. Take a coffee and tea break. Just behind the green wall, you will find some refreshments. We can continue talking